It was a dark and stormy night. No, seriously, it was. This is not some cheesy opening line. It was a dark and stormy night that, in fact, changed the course of history. For from that night, we can trace back to many of the freedoms that we take for granted today, such as religious liberty, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, the freedom to hold different opinions to those who are in power. It was on the night of July 2nd, 1505, when a young German law student was riding horseback and was caught in a ferocious storm. A bolt of lightning struck so close that it threw him off the horse and into the mud. And like most, when faced with a life-threatening situation, vowed that if God would just spare his life, then he would dedicate the rest of his life to God's service. But unlike most who say that, he actually meant it. Immediately afterwards, he gave up his law studies and became a monk. His name, of course, was Martin Luther. This October 31st marks the 500th anniversary of something else that Luther did a few years later in 1517. After being distressed at how far the church had drifted from biblical teaching from the Bible, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, setting off the Reformation. Now, how that impacted the church is legendary, and you can read all about it yourself. But how it impacted the surrounding culture, how it still affects us today, is less well known. Luther was very much the Galileo of his day, just as how Galileo would later on challenge the official views of the cosmos by comparing those with his own observations. Luther would challenge various theological positions of the church by comparing those with his own observations from Scripture. Now, you may be inclined to think, what does a monk 500 years ago challenging religious dogma have anything to do with our secular culture today? Well, what we need to understand is that back then, religion was the power structure. It was absolute. It had been that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was no separation of church and state. And the most powerful man in Europe was a pope who was deemed infallible. Whatever he said was official church teaching was absolute. So to challenge any of that teaching was to challenge the most powerful man around. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not as though it was like in Stalinist Russia where if you were suspected of even thinking contrary to Stalin, you were taken out and immediately shot. It wasn't like that at all. But if a person openly and persistently challenged official church teaching, they might very well end up being burned at the stake. Now, just like Galileo, how he wasn't the first one to believe that the earth circled the sun, there were people prior to Luther who held similar positions as he did. But for whatever reason, just like Galileo, he was history's chosen sledgehammer to smash old ideas, making way for new ones. Like all of us, Luther was a fallible human being, and it's unfortunate that at the end of his life he became quite anti-Semitic. But the positive things of his legacy remain with us today. So the next time that you're caught in a thunderstorm, remember that one young man's frightening experience and how that has given you the ability and the freedom to believe differently from those in authority.